So we're going to break our discussion of evolution into two main parts, microevolution and macroevolution. And microevolution is the small changes that happen within a species from generation to generation. And there's two key points to this definition. First, within a species, and second, from generation to generation. So this is a pretty short time scale. As I mentioned earlier, we are discussing the modern evolutionary theory, and that involves modern genetics. This is terms that Darwin and Wallace didn't have at their disposal, and I need to give you some quick background on those items. We will learn a lot more about the genetics later in the class, but for now I want to go through some basic definitions. So the genotype is the genetic makeup of a particular individual. The phenotype is the physical appearance and actual behavior of a particular individual, and this results from the interaction of the genotype and the environment. So, for example, I have red hair. That is a phenotype. That's what I physically look like. That red hair is the result of my genotype interacting with the environment. I have the genetics for red hair, but my hair is darker in the winter, lighter in the summertime, and that's the environmental component. Our next definition is species, and this is a word we throw around a lot, but it's actually pretty complicated to define, and there are 5 or 6 different species definitions floating around out there. We're just going to cover 2. The first one is the biological species definition, and this defines a species as a group of organisms that can reproduce and produce viable offspring. And there's 2 key parts to this. The individuals need to be able to reproduce, and their offspring need to be able to reproduce as well. The morphological species definition is a group of organisms with similar, unique set of physical characteristics. So here we're looking at shape and color and saying, well, that's a snowy owl because it looks like other snowy owls. There's some problems with these species definitions, and you can probably guess if you have 5 or 6 different ones that there's different issues with each one. The biological species concept can't be applied to fossils or asexually reproducing organisms. If you reproduce by budding off an exact copy of yourself, that's not a good way to determine if a group of organisms are interacting and reproducing. And obviously, if you have 2 fossils laying next to each other, you're never going to be able to figure out if they could reproduce and produce viable offspring. The biological species concept is also difficult to apply in the field every day. So when I go out and say, hey, that's a red-tailed hawk, or that's a mastiff bat, I'm saying that because of how it looks. I'm using the morphological species definition. I'm not catching that bat, having it breed with another mastiff bat, and seeing if its babies can reproduce as well. So the biological species concept isn't as practical. The morphological species concept has its own set of problems. While it's practical in the field, you can sometimes mistakenly assign an organism to the wrong group. You can put 2 different species that look the same and lump them together, or you could take members of the same species that look very different and assign them mistakenly to different species. And here's 2 examples of this. We have the western meadowlark and the eastern meadowlark. And to most of us, there's a few differences, but basically they look identical. However, one is west of the Rockies and one is east of the Rockies, and they never interbreed. And so they are actually biologically different species, even though morphologically they look like they might be the same. And then humans are a great example of the problem with the morphological species concept. We might look at all these individuals and say, oh, they all look very different and they should be classified as different species. But all these individuals can happily meet up and produce offspring that can go on to produce offspring. So differences are literally skin deep with the different races, and biologically we are very much all the same species. Our next definition is a population. And a population is all of the members of a particular species in a particular area. Notice as we go through these definitions that all of the definitions use the previous word we defined in their definition. So this population, we're talking about a particular species. This is just one species. So here we have a tree frog. All of the tree frogs that live in this pond would be a population. All the tree frogs in this pond would be a population, and all the tree frogs in this pond would be a population. Members of a population are more likely to interbreed with each other than with other members of a different population. So you can imagine all the frogs here are more likely to interbreed with each other than with a frog from this pond. But they're still the same species, and if one of the frogs hops along and ends up over here, it could reproduce and produce viable offspring. Our next definition is the gene pool, and this is all the varieties of all of the genes in a population. And we have a special name for those different varieties, and those are alleles. And I'll give you an example of this here in a minute. Gene frequency is the percent of each gene variety in that population. So certain alleles might be more common, certain alleles might be less common in a particular population. So let me provide you an example. So here we are again with our tree frog population. And within our tree frog population, we're going to have specific genes. And those genes are going to combine to make the overall gene pool. And so I'm just using a couple things as an example. We'll use skin color and size as two genes within the population. The alleles are going to be all of the possible varieties of those genes. And so we'll say for skin color, there's the yellow variety, the green variety, and the brown variety. And for size, we'll say that there's large and small varieties. So the gene pool, all the varieties of all of the different genes, here we've got all these different possibilities. And that's what we mean when we're talking about the gene pool. The gene frequencies then are the actual percentages, how common or rare particular alleles are in the population. And so in this population you can see about half the frogs are green and a little over half are large. And then we've got a mix of yellow and brown frogs. Remember that we define microevolution as the change in gene frequency over time. So if we come back to this pond a year later and count the number of yellow, green, and brown frogs, and large and small, we're going to get percentages, and we want to look at those. If these percentages have changed, in this case, yellow has gone down, green has gone down, and brown has gone up, we have microevolution. Small changes within a species over generations. In the size, again, if we see a shift in gene frequency, then we have microevolution. And you can go back to Darwin and Wallace's ideas and think about this a little bit. Maybe the environment changed and you're in a drought year, and so the brown frogs blend in with the dead grass better than in a year that's really wet for those green and yellow frogs. So this concept map is going to show you how all the different components of microevolution work together, and we'll go and talk about each one of these in detail, but we'll keep coming back to this overall map. What we need to start off with is a gene pool of a population. Evolution happens to populations, not individuals. Microevolution is a change in gene frequency over time. So we're taking the gene pool of a population and it's shifting in those percentages over time. And if you think about the time scale of this, the time will be in generations. And that gives you a hint about evolution that it's not quite the same for different species. So a fly is going to evolve at a faster rate than an elephant or a whale. The time or the length of a generation is going to determine how fast a particular species can evolve. Some species, like bacteria, can reproduce every 20 minutes, and so they're going to have a very fast rate of evolution. The next thing we need is genetic variation. Think about it. If a population was all identical, let's say you had all green frogs that were large, the next generation would have all green frogs that are large. And that would happen over and over again. So you can't have a change in gene frequency if there's not variety existing in the population. And there's a couple ways that we add variety to populations: mutations, sexual reproduction, and gene flow. And we'll discuss all these in a minute. And then genetic drift is a way that we actually lose genetic variation in a population. So mutations are the only way to get completely new alleles into a population. And mutations are small mistakes in the DNA code as the DNA is copied, and those mistakes are passed on. And we're going to talk more about the logistics of how that happens at a cellular level. Mutations certainly happen, but recombination, sexual reproduction, is where most of the variation in populations comes from. And this is the sperm and the egg putting existing gene varieties into new combinations. So mom has a set of genes, dad has a set of genes, and they come together in a new combination that hasn't ever existed before. Other ways that gene frequencies can change include gene flow. And gene flow is when individuals move from one population to the next and bring new gene varieties with them. And this is really a fancy word for migration from one population to another. So let's say you've got bighorn sheep living in the Sierra Nevada mountains, and then you have bighorn sheep living down in the desert. And a desert bighorn leaves the desert and heads up to the mountains, but it brings its desert genes with it that can influence the population in the mountains, and we call that gene flow. Genetic drift is a way that we lose variety due to random chance. Genetic drift is due entirely to chance. And here's a real simple example of genetic drift. Imagine a population where the gene pool includes red, pink, and white flowers. In every generation, not all of these flowers reproduce. The pollen is moved from flower to flower by a bee. And let's say just by chance, one generation, only the red individuals are able to reproduce. And we can see in one generation that we've lost the pink and the white alleles, and now we've lost genetic diversity in this population. You can imagine that genetic drift is primarily a problem in very, very small population sizes. So endangered species are often subject to this kind of issue with genetic drift. So their populations are already really small, and then they are losing more and more diversity because of random chance. So to review back at our concept map, we start with the gene pool of a population, all the members of a particular species in a particular area. We have variety in that population due to mutation, sexual reproduction, and gene flow. And over time, certain individuals have more babies than others, and we have a change in gene frequency over time. The last piece of the puzzle here is what pushes certain individuals to have the babies more than others. And that's the mechanism of natural selection. Natural selection can be defined as greater reproductive success for certain individuals in a population due to genetically determined characteristics. So I know that definition is a mouthful, but let's just look at the parts. Greater reproductive success. That's a fancy biology way of saying having more babies. For certain individuals, this only works if some individuals have more babies and some individuals have less, due to genetically determined characteristics. So the characteristics that allow certain individuals to have more babies must have some genetic component. Remember, the characteristics or the phenotype are going to have an environmental component and a genetic component. And only those with a genetic component will cause an actual change in gene frequency in the population. So natural selection is the mechanism that determines the direction or increase or decrease of the gene frequency for a particular trait. Natural selection is sometimes referred to as survival of the fittest, and this works as long as we understand the biological definition of fitness. Biological fitness just means having more babies. So fittest does not necessarily mean the biggest or strongest. And I have sort of a fun example of this. In the rainforests in South America, there are particular species of frog that mates using a lek mating system. And the lek mating system is sort of a fun one for the ladies in the group. All the males gather in a particular place and they do whatever it is they do to show off. In this case, the frogs will croak, and the larger the male is, the deeper the croak. And so the females hang out around the edge and they listen, and then they head in towards the sound they like the most and say, well, I'll mate with that one. So a little bit about frog biology. These guys don't have internal fertilization. So the female is going to squirt eggs out into the water, and the male is going to hop on her back and squirt the sperm on the water right next to her. So in this population, you've got the regular males that are doing their thing, but there are also silent sneaker males, and they're significantly smaller than the regular males, and they don't make any noise at all. Instead, when a female is heading in to select her mate, he will sneak onto her and try and mate with her as she's heading in for the other male. And there's a reason that we know that this strategy works, and that's because there's more baby sneaker males every year. So, being big and having a deep croak will certainly help you have babies, but there's an alternative strategy that is equally fit in terms of biology, not that they're big and strong, but they're silent and sneaky. So again, natural selection is going to be the mechanism that drives this process of change within populations. An adaptation is a trait that gives an organism greater reproductive success and survival in a particular environment. So adaptations are what natural selection is actually going to act on. Again, remember that reproductive success is what we mean by biological fitness. Adaptations can include physical adaptations, so parts of the body, behavioral adaptations, those would be actions that an individual takes, and physiological adaptations, and this would be some kind of chemical reaction inside the body producing a toxin or being able to break down a toxin would be examples of physiological adaptations. So one of the questions is, why would a particular species develop a particular adaptation, be it physical, behavioral, or physiological? And of course, it's going to be the environmental conditions. The environmental conditions will create what we call selection pressures. Environmental conditions could be the physical environment, could be that there's a drought or you live in a desert, could be that you live on dark rocks or light rocks. Environmental conditions can also be biotic. They can be what predators are in an area, or what food is available in a particular area, or who you're competing with. All of those are potential selective pressures. So this video about swallow wings will give you a nice example of selective pressure and microevolution. A couple additional points I want to make about natural selection. Natural selection acts on the phenotype, the adaptation, physical, behavioral, physiological. But evolution only occurs if there is a genetic basis for the phenotype. So if a white rabbit trips and falls and lands in a mud pit and is able to live 2 years longer because it's covered in mud than other members of its population, and it has more babies, it's not passing on the trait of darker colored fur, and so that's not natural selection. It's not microevolution because we won't see an actual change in gene frequency. However, if rolling in a mud pit is a behavioral adaptation that has a genetic basis and that gets passed on, then we have evolution occurring. When we look at natural selection in nature, we see three main patterns. Directional selection is when natural selection is favoring individuals at one end of the phenotypic range, and we'll look at an example of what this is in a minute. Disruptive selection favors individuals at both extremes of a phenotypic range. And stabilizing selection favors intermediate variants and acts against really extreme phenotypes. So let's look at what that really means. This is a graph showing the number of individuals of each color. This is one species of mouse and it ranges from light to dark. And notice we're starting out with a normal distribution with most of the mice at light brown. The dash shows the next generation, and so we're seeing a change in gene frequency over time for coat color. So this first one is representing directional selection. So here the darker colored mice are having more babies, and so the entire species is moving towards a darker color. Disruptive selection is when the two extremes of the phenotypes are favored. In this case, very light mice or very dark mice, but the intermediate, the light brown, is being selected against. And then finally you have stabilizing selection, and in this case the most common intermediate form is being selected for, and individuals on the extremes, too dark or too light, are not having very many babies. So here's an activity to test your understanding of microevolution and natural selection. You can refer back to our concept map and see if you can explain what happened here. Modern agriculture relies heavily on the use of pesticides, chemicals that spray on crops to kill off pest insects. Recently, farmers have found that pesticides that worked 25 years ago are no longer working. Use your understanding of microevolution and natural selection to explain this. Please note that "they evolved" is not an adequate answer. I want you to explain the details of how this might happen.